You're alone in a room and you start talking, not to anyone, just out loud to yourself. Maybe you're working through a problem. Maybe you're rehearsing a conversation that hasn't happened yet. Maybe you just said, okay, let's do this before standing up from the couch, and then someone walks in, and you stop immediately. Because something about being caught talking to yourself feels like getting caught doing something you shouldn't. But here's the thing, you were doing something important. Something that the most intelligent people on the planet do more than anyone else. Talking to yourself isn't a sign that something is wrong with you. The research suggests it might be one of the clearest signs that something is very, very right. Almost every human being talks to themselves. Studies estimate somewhere between 96 and 100% of adults report some form of inner or outer self-talk. That's not a quirk. That's essentially the entire species. But for most of human history, it was treated as something to hide. Ancient Greeks associated talking to oneself with divine madness. Medieval Europeans thought it meant demonic possession. Even today, the phrase talking to yourself carries a social stigma that has almost nothing to do with what the behavior actually is. So what is it actually? In the 1930s, a Soviet psychologist named Lev Vygotsky made an observation that changed how scientists think about language itself. He noticed that young children around ages 3 to 5 narrate everything they do out loud. Now I put the block here. Now the tower is tall. Now it falls down. At the time, most scientists called this egocentric speech. Meaningless noise, children talking because they hadn't yet learned to be quiet. Vygotsky thought they were completely wrong. He argued that this out-loud narration wasn't meaningless at all. It was the child's thinking process made audible. The child wasn't talking and thinking. Talking was the thinking, and as children grow up, that out-loud process doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It becomes the voice inside your head, what psychologists now call inner speech. The internal monologue running in your mind right now is the direct descendant of a child saying, "Now I put the block here." You didn't stop talking to yourself. You just learned to do it quietly. In 2012, a psychologist named Gary Lupien at the University of Wisconsin ran a simple experiment. He gave participants a list of objects to find in a supermarket. One group searched in silence. The other group was told to repeat the name of the object out loud while searching. The group talking to themselves found the objects significantly faster. Not slightly faster. Significantly, what Lupien discovered was that saying a word out loud activates the brain's visual system more powerfully than just thinking it. When you say red apple out loud, your brain becomes measurably better at recognizing red apples. The sound of your own voice acts like a spotlight, sharpening perception and narrowing focus onto exactly what you're looking for. Your own voice, it turns out, is one of the most powerful focusing tools your brain has access to. And you carry it everywhere for free, but it goes deeper than focus. In 2017, researchers at Bangor University in Wales found something that surprised even them. They asked participants to complete a difficult task, first in silence, then while reading instructions aloud to themselves. Performance improved significantly when participants read aloud, but the researchers expected that. What they didn't expect was what happened to stress levels. Participants who read instructions aloud to themselves showed lower cortisol responses under pressure. They were not just performing better, they were physiologically calmer. The act of hearing your own voice seemed to regulate the nervous system in a way that silent thinking didn't. Your voice reaches your brain through two pathways simultaneously, through the air like any external sound, and through bone conduction directly through your skull. No other sound reaches your brain that way. Your own voice is neurologically unique, and the brain responds to it differently than it responds to anything else. Now here's where it gets interesting. In 2020, a research team led by Ethan Kross at the University of Michigan published findings from a decade of studying self-talk across thousands of participants. One of their clearest findings was this: people with higher measured cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between tasks, hold multiple ideas simultaneously, and think through complex problems, reported significantly higher rates of self-talk than people with lower cognitive flexibility. The relationship wasn't coincidental, it was structural. The people who were better at complex thinking were using self-talk as an active tool to do it. Think about what self-talk actually requires. To narrate your own thinking, you have to step outside yourself for a moment. You have to observe your own mental process from a slight distance. Psychologists call this metacognition, thinking about thinking. When you say out loud, okay, so if I do this first, then that creates a problem over here, you're not just solving the problem, you're watching yourself solve the problem. You're a director and an actor simultaneously. And that dual perspective, being both inside and outside your own thinking at the same time, is one of the most sophisticated cognitive operations a brain can perform. Most animals can't do it at all. Young children can barely do it. And the people who do it most naturally and most frequently tend to perform better on almost every measure of complex reasoning we have. Albert Einstein reportedly talked to himself constantly while working. He described his thinking process as a kind of internal conversation. Charles Darwin filled notebooks with dialogue he was having with himself about his own theories. Elite athletes in every sport use instructional self-talk, specific out-loud commands to their own bodies, as a measurable performance tool. Studies show it improves execution of complex physical skills by up to 12%. The people we tend to associate with extreme intelligence or extreme performance are, almost without exception, the people who talk to themselves the most. But here's the part nobody mentions: not all self-talk is equal. And the kind you default to when no one is watching matters more than almost anything else in your life. Ethan Kross spent years specifically studying what happens when the internal voice turns negative, the phenomenon he calls chatter, the loop of self-critical ruminative, replaying in a speech that most people experience after failure, rejection, embarrassment, or stress. What his research found was disturbing. Negative self-talk doesn't just feel bad. It activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. The brain processes harsh self-criticism the same way it processes being physically hurt, and it doesn't stop there. People locked in chatter loops show measurable increases in inflammatory markers in the blood. Sustained negative self-talk produces physiological stress responses identical to external threats. Your brain cannot fully distinguish between someone attacking you from outside and you attacking yourself from inside. The voice you use to focus, to solve problems, to regulate your nervous system, to outperform people who stay silent, is the same voice that can become the most efficient instrument of self-destruction a human being possesses. One study found that people who lose jobs are more likely to remain unemployed long-term, not because of their skills, but because of the internal narrative they develop about why it happened. The story they tell themselves, alone, out loud or inside, becomes the story they act from. The content of self-talk matters as much as the practice of it, and this is where the research takes an unexpected turn. Kross discovered something that sounds almost too simple. When people talk to themselves using their own name instead of I, their performance under pressure changes dramatically. Instead of "why am I so nervous, I can't do this," you say, "why is your name nervous? What does your name need right now?" This tiny linguistic shift, moving from first-person to third-person self-talk, produces measurable differences in brain activity. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making, becomes more active. The amygdala, the part that processes threat and fear, becomes less active. You're giving yourself the same psychological distance you'd naturally have when advising a friend. And it turns out that distance is not just emotional, it's neurological. Your brain literally processes the situation differently when you refer to yourself by name. LeBron James has spoken publicly about using third-person self-talk during high-pressure moments. Malala Yousafzai described using it during the most terrifying periods of her life. Research subjects who were told to use it before public speaking performed measurably better and reported significantly lower anxiety. The simple act of saying your own name to yourself activates a cognitive tool that has no pharmaceutical equivalent and costs nothing to use. So let's go back to that room. You're alone and you start talking. You're not doing something embarrassing. You're doing something that 96 to 100% of your species does, something that children do instinctively before anyone teaches them to be quiet, something that the most cognitively flexible humans do more than anyone else, something that physically calms your nervous system, sharpens your perception, and improves performance under pressure. What changed wasn't the behavior. What changed was that at some point, someone saw you doing it and made you feel like you should stop. And you learned to move it underground into silence, where it became invisible and unexamined, and sometimes darker than it ever needed to be. Lev Vygotsky watched 3-year-olds narrate their own lives and understood something that took the rest of science decades to confirm. The voice is not separate from the thinking. The voice is the thinking made audible. Every breakthrough you've ever had while explaining a problem out loud to an empty room. Every time you coached yourself through something scary by saying your own name. Every rehearsal of a difficult conversation you held with no one but yourself. That was never strange. That was always your most powerful tool, doing exactly what it was built to do. The only question is whether you're going to use it deliberately, or keep apologizing for it when someone walks in.